"Excuse me, could you take this coffee into the briefing room?" The young officer did not even look up as he extended the tray toward the woman standing beside the entrance. Around him, officers hurried through the headquarters building carrying folders, tablets, and classified briefing packets. Nobody paid much attention to the woman he had just mistaken for support staff. She simply accepted the tray with a polite smile. The headquarters of the Joint Operations Command was already buzzing before sunrise. Uniformed personnel moved through the wide hallways beneath bright lights, preparing for one of the most important strategic briefings of the year. Senior leaders from multiple commands were arriving from across the country. Every conference room seemed occupied. Every officer appeared focused on the long day ahead. The woman carrying the coffee tray walked calmly through the crowded corridor. She was in her early 40s, with neatly tied blonde hair and a simple army uniform that displayed surprisingly little decoration compared to many officers around her. Her posture was confident but unassuming. She did not draw attention to herself. In fact, she seemed perfectly comfortable being overlooked. As she approached the main conference room, another officer opened the door for her without really noticing who she was. "Perfect timing," he said. "Just leave those near the front." Again, she simply nodded. Inside, dozens of officers were already taking their seats around a massive conference table. Large digital displays covered the walls. Maps, operational graphics, and planning schedules glowed across the screens. Conversations filled the room as commanders discussed assignments and recent developments. The woman carefully placed the coffee tray on a side table before moving toward an empty seat near the back. Nobody stopped her. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody asked her name. A few people assumed she was part of the administrative staff. One colonel even handed her a stack of printed agendas without looking directly at her. "These need to get distributed," he said. The woman accepted them without complaint. Across the room sat Colonel Michael Turner. At 50 years old, Turner had built a reputation as a respected operations officer. He noticed the woman briefly as she moved between tables. Like everyone else, he assumed she worked support for the event. His attention quickly returned to a conversation with several commanders seated nearby. The briefing was scheduled to begin in less than 30 minutes. Yet one topic seemed to dominate every discussion: the arrival of a newly assigned senior commander. Rumors had circulated for weeks. Some said the officer had led major strategic initiatives overseas. Others claimed the officer was one of the most respected leaders in the military. The only thing everyone agreed on was that very few people had actually met the individual in person. "Have you seen the new commander yet?" one officer asked. Turner shook his head. "Not yet." Another officer laughed. "Hopefully they are not late on their first day." Several people chuckled. Near the back of the room, the woman quietly arranged the agendas and took a seat. She listened without interrupting. She watched the conversations unfold. Outside the conference room windows, the first light of morning began to spread across the military installation. Inside, nobody realized that the person they had spent the last 20 minutes overlooking was about to become the most important person in the building. The woman sitting quietly near the back of the conference room was Brigadier General Rebecca Hayes, although nobody present seemed to realize it. That was not entirely surprising. During most of her career, Rebecca had spent far more time leading operations than seeking attention. Her name was well known inside military planning circles, but her face was not. Many officers had read reports carrying her signature. Few had ever stood in the same room with her. As conversations continued around the conference table, Rebecca calmly reviewed the briefing agenda that had been handed to her only minutes earlier. The document outlined a series of strategic discussions involving multiple commands and several large-scale initiatives scheduled for the coming year. She knew every topic listed on the schedule. In fact, she had personally approved most of them. Across the room, Colonel Michael Turner remained engaged in conversation with several senior officers. The discussion eventually returned to the mysterious commander everyone was waiting to meet. "I heard she helped redesign 3 major readiness programs," one officer said. Another nodded. That is what I heard too. Apparently headquarters wanted someone who could coordinate across every branch. Turner leaned back in his chair. Well, if the stories are true, she has a lot to live up to. The group laughed lightly. Nearby, Rebecca continued reading without reacting. She had heard similar conversations many times before. Expectations often followed positions of authority. Assumptions followed even faster. A few minutes later, another officer entered carrying additional folders. Seeing Rebecca seated near the back, he walked directly toward her. "Could you place these at each seat before we begin?" he asked. Rebecca accepted the folders with the same calm professionalism she had shown all morning. "Of course," she replied. The officer thanked her and hurried away without ever asking who she was. One by one, Rebecca distributed the documents around the room. Several officers accepted them absent-mindedly. Some barely looked up. Others offered polite smiles. None recognized the rank hidden in plain sight. Outside the conference room, headquarters staff moved quickly through the hallways as final preparations continued. The briefing was supposed to begin soon, yet the individual everyone was waiting for had still not arrived. At least, that was what they believed. Turner checked his watch. "We are getting close to start time." One of the commanders shrugged. Maybe her flight was delayed. Or maybe headquarters enjoys keeping us guessing, another joked. More laughter followed. Rebecca returned to her seat and folded her hands calmly in front of her. Her expression remained relaxed. There was no irritation. No impatience. If anything, she seemed amused by the situation unfolding around her. She understood that first impressions often shape people's expectations. She also understood how quickly those expectations could change. At the front of the room, the large digital display cycled through operational maps and planning schedules. Officers continued discussing policy, readiness, budgets, and leadership transitions. Yet beneath every conversation remained the same unanswered question. Who exactly was the new commander? What none of them realized was that the answer had already spent nearly half an hour inside the room, carrying coffee, handing out agendas, distributing briefing packets, and quietly observing every assumption being made about her. And with each passing minute, the moment when those assumptions would collide with reality moved closer and closer. The conference room continued filling as the scheduled start time approached. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Coffee cups were carried from table to table. Conversations overlapped in dozens of small groups as officers reviewed notes and exchanged opinions about upcoming initiatives. The atmosphere remained professional, but there was also a growing impatience hanging over the room. Everyone was waiting for someone who had not yet appeared. Or so they believed. Colonel Michael Turner glanced toward the entrance again before checking his watch for what felt like the 10th time that morning. 5 minutes late, he said. Not exactly the best first impression. Several nearby officers nodded. One commander shrugged. Maybe headquarters changed the schedule. Another shook his head. Not likely. They have been talking about this appointment for months. Turner leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Then hopefully the new commander is worth the suspense. Around the table, a few quiet laughs followed. Near the back of the room, Rebecca Hayes remained seated with a briefing folder resting on her lap. She watched the discussion unfold with the calm expression of someone observing a familiar pattern. Throughout her career, she had learned that people often revealed far more about themselves while waiting than while working. Waiting created assumptions. Assumptions created stories. And stories were often wrong. A captain entered carrying a box of presentation materials and immediately spotted Rebecca. "Would you mind helping me place these near the front display?" he asked. Without hesitation, Rebecca stood and assisted him. Together they arranged several packets beside the podium. The captain thanked her and hurried away. Once again, he never asked her name. From across the room, Turner noticed the interaction. "See," one officer beside him said quietly. "Support staff is working harder than half the people here." Turner smiled slightly. At least somebody is prepared. Rebecca heard the comment. She simply continued organizing the materials before returning to her seat. There was no irritation on her face. No reaction at all. If anything, she appeared completely comfortable. The digital clock mounted above the main display advanced another minute. Conversations gradually shifted away from strategy and toward speculation. One officer claimed the incoming commander had spent years overseeing international operations. Another insisted the position had been created specifically because of the officer's reputation for solving difficult organizational problems. A third admitted he had searched for photographs online but found almost nothing. "That is strange," he said. "You would think someone at that level would have a public profile." Turner nodded. "Some leaders spend more time working than posing for photographs." More laughter followed. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly toward the briefing folder. Hidden behind the cover page was a detailed strategic plan she had personally developed during the previous 6 months. Every major topic scheduled for discussion that morning carried her fingerprints. Every recommendation reflected her decisions. Yet nobody in the room connected the woman quietly sitting among them to the authority they were waiting for. Outside the conference room, footsteps echoed through the hallway. Several officers instinctively looked toward the door. For a moment, the room grew quieter. Then the footsteps passed by. The conversations resumed. Turner shook his head. "This is getting ridiculous." Across the room, Rebecca glanced toward the front display where the opening slide remained frozen on the screen. The briefing was supposed to begin any minute. The assumptions inside the room were becoming stronger. The reveal waiting just ahead was becoming larger. And soon, every person seated around that table would discover that the commander they were waiting for had never been late at all. The digital clock above the main display advanced another 3 minutes. What had started as mild curiosity was turning into visible frustration throughout the conference room. Officers shifted in their seats. Several checked their phones. Others whispered comments to colleagues seated nearby. The briefing had still not begun, and the commander everyone had gathered to meet remained nowhere in sight. Colonel Michael Turner stood and walked toward the front of the room. He glanced at the large display screens, then toward the entrance. "At this point," he said with a faint smile, "I am beginning to think headquarters enjoys testing our patience." A few officers laughed. One commander replied, "Maybe this is part of some leadership exercise." Another added, "If it is, I think we are all failing." The room relaxed briefly as more laughter followed. Near the back, Rebecca Hayes remained quietly seated. She observed the conversations with calm interest. Years of leadership had taught her something important. People often revealed their true character during moments they believed carried no consequences. Some remained professional. Others became careless. This morning was proving no different. A lieutenant entered the room carrying several updated briefing packets. He hesitated when he realized some seats were still missing materials. His eyes landed on Rebecca. "Would you mind helping with these?" he asked. Rebecca stood immediately. "Not at all." Together they distributed the remaining packets. Several officers accepted them without looking up. One thanked her absent-mindedly. Another simply reached for the papers while continuing a conversation. Turner watched the exchange from across the room. "That woman has been working harder than anybody here all morning," he remarked. One officer chuckled. "She probably knows more about this briefing than we do by now." Turner laughed. "Maybe we should let her run the meeting." The comment generated another round of amusement around the table. Rebecca heard every word. She simply returned to her seat and opened her folder. Her expression never changed. The room slowly settled again. The jokes faded. The conversations quieted. Everyone's attention shifted back toward the entrance. Then something unusual happened. Outside the conference room, several senior aides appeared in the hallway. Their pace was deliberate, professional, focused. A moment later, a command sergeant major stopped near the doorway. His presence alone caused several officers to straighten in their chairs. Conversations immediately began dying down. Turner noticed it too. "Looks like something is finally happening," he said. The room became noticeably quieter. More personnel gathered outside. Several senior leaders who had not previously been present entered and took positions along the sides of the room. The atmosphere changed instantly. The casual humor disappeared. A sense of anticipation replaced it. Rebecca calmly closed her folder and placed it on the table. For the first time all morning, she looked directly toward the front of the room. Turner followed her gaze without realizing it. The command sergeant major stepped inside and scanned the room. His expression was serious, professional, formal. Every conversation stopped completely. The silence that followed felt different from anything earlier that morning. It was the kind of silence that arrives just before something important changes. Then the command sergeant major took a breath and spoke two words that immediately brought every person in the room to attention. "Stand by." Every officer in the conference room immediately straightened. Conversations vanished. Coffee cups were quietly set aside. Chairs stopped moving. The command sergeant major stood near the doorway with the composed expression of someone accustomed to commanding attention without raising his voice. The room remained perfectly still. Colonel Michael Turner exchanged a brief glance with several officers seated nearby. Whatever was about to happen clearly carried significance. Yet after several long seconds, nobody entered. The doorway remained empty. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Turner checked the entrance again. Then the hallway beyond it. Nothing. One commander quietly cleared his throat. Another shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The anticipation that had been building all morning seemed to tighten across the room. Finally, the command sergeant major spoke again. "The briefing will begin shortly." His voice was calm and precise. Then he stepped aside and took a position near the wall. That was all. No introduction. No announcement. No explanation. The officers remained standing for another moment before gradually returning to their seats. Confused looks appeared around the table. Turner leaned toward the officer beside him. "I thought the commander was arriving." "So did I," the officer replied. Across the room, whispers quietly returned. Nobody seemed willing to speak loudly anymore. Whatever confidence had fueled the earlier jokes had largely disappeared. Rebecca Hayes sat quietly in her seat near the back of the room. Her posture remained relaxed. Her folder rested closed on the table in front of her. Unlike everyone else, she appeared completely unaffected by the growing uncertainty. A few minutes passed. Then 5 more. The large display screens continued cycling through briefing graphics and operational summaries. The digital clock advanced steadily. The commander everyone expected still had not appeared. Turner finally shook his head. "This is unbelievable." Several officers nodded in agreement. "Headquarters could have handled this better," one of them muttered. Another replied, "Maybe the commander is reviewing something important." Turner folded his arms. "Then somebody should tell us." Nearby, a lieutenant entered carrying a final stack of briefing materials. He paused when he noticed several empty folders still sitting near the front of the room. His eyes immediately landed on Rebecca. "Could you help me place these at the head table?" he asked. Rebecca smiled politely. "Of course." She stood and carried the folders toward the front. Turner watched her again. There was something oddly familiar about the confidence she carried. Not confidence in the usual sense. She was not trying to impress anyone. She simply moved with the quiet certainty of someone who belonged wherever she happened to be standing. Rebecca arranged the folders carefully, then paused beside the podium. For a brief moment, her eyes moved across the room. She seemed to study the officers seated around the table. Then she returned to her seat. Turner frowned slightly. He could not explain why. Something about the situation suddenly felt different. Outside the conference room, footsteps approached once again. This time they did not continue down the hallway. They stopped directly outside the door. A senior aide entered carrying a tablet and walked straight to the command sergeant major. The two exchanged a few quiet words. Then the aide nodded. The command sergeant major immediately stepped forward. His voice echoed through the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen, please rise." Every chair moved at once as the officers rose to their feet. The room became completely silent. Colonel Michael Turner stood with the others, his eyes fixed on the entrance. After nearly an hour of waiting, he expected a senior commander to walk through the doorway at any moment. Instead, the doorway remained empty. Several seconds passed. Then the command sergeant major turned away from the entrance and looked directly toward the back of the room. "Brigadier General Rebecca Hayes," he announced. "The room is ready." For a moment, nobody reacted. The words seemed to hang in the air without meaning. Then dozens of eyes followed the command sergeant major's gaze. One by one, every officer turned toward the same person. Toward the woman who had carried the coffee tray. Toward the woman who had distributed agendas. Toward the woman many of them had mistaken for support staff. Rebecca Hayes slowly stood from her seat. The silence became absolute. Colonel Turner felt his stomach drop. His mind immediately replayed every conversation from the morning. Every assumption. Every joke. Every careless remark. Around the room, expressions shifted from confusion to disbelief. Several officers looked at one another as if searching for confirmation that they had heard correctly. Rebecca calmly picked up her folder and began walking toward the front of the room. Her pace was unhurried. Her posture was confident. She did not look angry. She did not look offended. She simply looked exactly like someone who belonged there. The command sergeant major stepped aside as she approached the podium. A senior aide immediately handed her a tablet. Another adjusted the presentation display. The level of respect shown toward her erased any remaining doubt. She was not a visitor. She was not support staff. She was the commander everyone had been waiting for all morning. Turner watched in stunned silence. The woman he had barely noticed had somehow become the most important person in the room. Rebecca reached the podium and placed her folder on the table. The large display behind her immediately changed. Her name appeared across the screen beside a list of commands, assignments, and strategic initiatives she had led throughout her career. Quiet murmurs spread through the room. Many officers were seeing the full scope of her experience for the first time. Several looked genuinely shocked. Rebecca allowed the room a few seconds to absorb the information before speaking. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was calm, clear, and effortless. Instantly the room became silent again. "I appreciate your patience this morning." A few officers shifted uncomfortably. Turner felt heat rising in his face. Rebecca continued. "I have spent the last hour observing this team. Listening. Learning. Watching how people interact when they believe nobody important is paying attention." The words landed heavily across the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Yet there was no accusation in her voice. No anger. Only quiet confidence. She looked around the conference table. Leadership is not demonstrated only when people know who you are. It is demonstrated when they do not. Several officers lowered their eyes. Turner remained frozen in place. Rebecca's gaze briefly passed across him before returning to the room. Then a faint smile appeared. "Now," she said, opening her briefing folder, "let us get to work." And in that moment, every person in the room realized the briefing they thought they had been waiting for was only just beginning. For the next 2 hours, nobody in the conference room looked at Brigadier General Rebecca Hayes the same way again. The atmosphere had changed completely. The casual assumptions that had filled the room earlier that morning had disappeared, replaced by focused attention and genuine respect. Rebecca stood at the front beside the large digital display, moving through complex strategic plans with remarkable clarity. Maps shifted across the screens behind her. Readiness projections, resource allocations, training schedules, and long-term operational goals appeared one after another. Yet what impressed the room was not simply her knowledge of the material. It was her command of every detail. Questions began almost immediately. A logistics officer raised concerns about transportation capacity during upcoming training cycles. Rebecca answered without consulting a single note. She referenced projected timelines, available resources, and previous program results from memory. The officer slowly nodded and sat back down. A communications commander followed with questions about coordination across multiple regions. Again, Rebecca responded with precise recommendations supported by data and practical experience. One by one, the challenges continued. One by one, she addressed them. Colonel Michael Turner watched from his seat in growing disbelief. He had attended hundreds of briefings throughout his career. Most leaders relied heavily on staff support, prepared notes, or technical experts. Rebecca seemed to carry the entire briefing in her head. More importantly, she never made anyone feel dismissed. When officers raised concerns, she listened carefully. When they disagreed, she encouraged discussion. Her authority came not from rank alone but from obvious competence. Halfway through the briefing, a senior commander challenged one of the proposed initiatives. The room immediately became attentive. It was a legitimate concern involving budget priorities and training resources. Several people expected a tense exchange. Instead, Rebecca welcomed the question. She invited the commander to explain his reasoning. After listening carefully, she walked through the data supporting the recommendation, acknowledged the risks, and proposed adjustments that addressed the concerns without compromising the overall objective. By the time she finished, even the commander who had challenged her was nodding in agreement. Turner found himself doing the same. The more he listened, the more uncomfortable his earlier assumptions became. Throughout the morning, Rebecca had never once mentioned the way she had been treated. She had never reminded anyone about the coffee tray, the misplaced agendas, or the mistaken assumptions. She acted as though none of it mattered. Her focus remained entirely on the mission and the people in the room. That realization affected Turner more than any public criticism could have. As the briefing continued, officers began engaging with a level of energy that had been absent earlier. Ideas flowed more freely. Discussions became more productive. Rebecca encouraged participation from every level of leadership. Junior officers who might normally remain silent found themselves contributing. Senior commanders listened more carefully. The room was no longer waiting for leadership to arrive. Leadership was already standing in front of them. By the time the final presentation slide appeared on the screen, the mood inside the conference room was dramatically different from the one that had existed only a few hours earlier. The officers who had arrived expecting to evaluate a new commander now found themselves learning from one. And as Brigadier General Rebecca Hayes closed her folder and looked across the room, it was clear that the briefing had accomplished far more than its official agenda. Without ever demanding respect, she had earned every bit of it. The briefing officially ended just after noon, but very few people left their seats immediately. Officers who normally rushed to their next meeting remained gathered around the conference table, continuing discussions that had begun during Rebecca Hayes' presentation. The energy inside the room felt completely different from the atmosphere that had existed earlier that morning. Instead of speculation and assumptions, there was engagement. Instead of uncertainty, there was confidence. Brigadier General Rebecca Hayes stepped away from the podium and began speaking individually with several commanders who had questions about future initiatives. She gave each person her full attention. Whether they were senior leaders or junior officers, her approach never changed. She listened carefully, answered thoughtfully, and treated every conversation as important. Colonel Michael Turner watched from across the room. The more he observed, the more uncomfortable he became with the memory of his own behavior. It was not that he had intended to be disrespectful. In his mind, he had simply made assumptions based on appearances and circumstances. Yet standing there now, he could clearly see how easily those assumptions had shaped his perception. Rebecca had walked into the room carrying coffee and organizing briefing materials, and everyone had immediately decided who they thought she was. Nobody had stopped to ask. Nobody had taken the time to find out. Turner noticed something else as well. Rebecca was not using her position to impress people. She was not reminding anyone of her accomplishments. She was not drawing attention to the authority she held. In fact, if someone entered the room at that moment without knowing her rank, they might have mistaken her for an advisor rather than the senior commander in charge. That quiet confidence seemed far more powerful than any title. As officers gradually prepared to leave, several stopped to thank her personally. One commander praised the clarity of the strategic plan. Another thanked her for addressing concerns that had gone unresolved for months. A younger officer expressed appreciation for the way she encouraged participation from everyone in the room. Rebecca accepted each comment graciously before redirecting the conversation back toward the mission and the team. Her focus never drifted toward herself. Eventually the conference room began to empty. The large digital displays returned to their standard screens. Support staff collected folders and briefing materials. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long reflections across the polished table. Rebecca gathered her notes and prepared to leave. Before she reached the door, she noticed several officers speaking quietly nearby. They were discussing ideas from the briefing and referencing recommendations she had presented. None of them realized she could hear them. Yet every comment reflected the same thing. Respect. Genuine respect. Not because of her rank. Not because of her title. Because of her competence. Because she had demonstrated leadership rather than demanding recognition. Rebecca paused for a moment and looked back across the room. Earlier that morning, she had entered as someone nobody recognized. Now she was leaving as the leader everyone trusted. The transformation had not happened because she revealed who she was. It had happened because she showed them who she was. And that difference mattered far more than any introduction ever could. Later that afternoon, the headquarters building gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Meetings resumed. Officers moved between offices carrying folders and tablets. Phones rang. Reports were reviewed. From the outside, it looked like any ordinary day inside a major military command. Yet for many of the people who had attended the morning briefing, something had changed. Colonel Michael Turner found himself thinking about it long after the conference room had emptied. He sat alone in his office reviewing notes from the presentation, but his attention kept drifting back to the events of the morning. The strategic recommendations had been impressive. The leadership had been exceptional. But what stayed with him most was not the briefing itself. It was the lesson hidden inside it. Eventually, Turner stood and walked down the hallway toward the command section. Several officers passed him along the way. A few were still discussing Rebecca Hayes and the impact she had made in only a few hours. Others were already implementing ideas from the briefing. The respect she had earned was now visible throughout the building. Turner stopped outside an office with a simple nameplate mounted beside the door. Brigadier General Rebecca Hayes. He hesitated for a moment before knocking. "Come in," Rebecca said. Turner entered. The office was surprisingly modest. A few photographs. Several books. A neatly organized desk covered with reports. Rebecca was reviewing documents when she looked up and smiled politely. "Colonel Turner." Turner stood awkwardly for a second. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course." Rebecca set aside the report she had been reading. Turner took a breath. Throughout his career, he had delivered difficult briefings, commanded large teams, and spoken before senior leaders without hesitation. Yet this conversation felt unexpectedly challenging. "I wanted to apologize," he said. Rebecca listened quietly. "For this morning?" Turner shook his head slightly. "Actually, for more than this morning. I made assumptions before I knew anything about you. I judged a situation without understanding it." Rebecca studied him for a moment before speaking. You were not the only one. Turner nodded. That does not make it right. A faint smile appeared on Rebecca's face. No. It does not. The office grew quiet. Then Rebecca leaned back slightly in her chair. Colonel, leadership positions create an interesting problem. Turner listened carefully. People often think authority announces itself. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does not. She glanced toward the window overlooking the installation. What matters is not whether people recognize you immediately. What matters is what they discover after they do. Turner considered the words carefully. They carried the same quiet wisdom that had shaped the entire day. No lecture. No criticism. Just perspective. After a few moments, he smiled. I think a lot of people learned something today. Rebecca laughed softly. Good. That means the briefing was successful. Turner stood to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back. For what it is worth, you handled the situation better than most people would have. Rebecca returned to her paperwork. Experience helps. Turner left the office with a smile. Outside, the headquarters building continued moving forward, just as it always had. But somewhere between a coffee tray and a command briefing, an entire room full of officers had been reminded of something. Easy to forget. Titles matter. Rank matters. Experience matters. But the quickest way to misunderstand someone is to decide who they are before giving them a chance to show you. And the strongest leaders never need to demand respect. They earn it through character, competence, and the example they set when nobody realizes who they are.